Feminism cannot be excluded from climate action plans. Activists and advocates say climate justice must be based on gender parity. Women and girls remain the biggest victims of the climate crisis.
Women are among the most vulnerable to the climate crisis. A concrete example of this was in 2013 in the Philippines with Typhoon Haiyan or Typhoon Yolanda. A lot of women and young girls were forced into prostitution and sex work because of the climate impacts that happened, and they couldn't bounce back, they couldn't adapt. In so many settings, when you're in evacuation centers, you are more prone to sexual harassment and violence, and just the hygiene of the place, it's not there. And so when we're talking about climate justice, it has to include feminism. It has to include class inequality, and it has to include racism. We have to think about everything, because all of these other socioeconomic crises amplify the climate crisis and are amplified by the climate crisis. And the same patriarchal, rich, racist system that we are in, this is what caused the climate crisis. And so we have to dismantle that in order to achieve climate justice.
UN figures indicate that 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women. The role of women and girls is integral in finding lasting sustainable solutions, and the lack of gender parity suppresses women's participation in the just transition.
We have to make sure that this is a human rights-based transition. We cannot leave half the world population behind. And currently, if we have so few women really able to take decisions on the future of their livelihoods, we are leaving them behind. We see very few women in the future renewable energy sector, for example. We still have a lack of women in science and technology, which makes that the new jobs are mostly going to the boys and the men and not to the women.
Meanwhile, protesters continue to use their voices as they advocate for more decisive leadership of this environmental emergency. Activists from small island developing nations say lack of action is putting the entire world at more risk.
Our leaders are talking while the oceans are rising around us. They need to be doing more than talk. They need to do everything they can to keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees. Especially high-emitting nations need to be held accountable for causing the climate crisis. And so these last 4 days of the negotiations, we are hoping that our leaders can come together, step up their commitments and ambitions, their nationally determined contributions, and also have more conversations around loss and damage, because the high-emitting nations need to pay for the climate crisis that they've caused.
Negotiations on financing of adaptation and mitigation continues. Article 6 of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which outlines the carbon market rules, is still being discussed. The talks have been described as tough, with some saying an agreement will not be reached by the conclusion of the conference at the end of the week. Nomapolani, SABC News.